Beep boop diddy boop beep boop boop beep boop boop.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Time is Money. My name is Mia Liu, and I'm currently a student at SF State for Equity and Social Justice, and I'm a stained glass instructor.
My name is Caroline McNally. I am also getting my master's in equity and social justice and education at SF State, and I am a high school English teacher at a public high school.
And my name is Danny Marquez. I am also a student for the Equity and Social Justice Master Program in San Francisco State. And I am a 12th grade academic counselor at a charter school in Oakland.
Now that we've gotten introductions out of the way, let's go somewhere where it'll be easier to record. Cool. And today we're going to be talking about the theme of time and the education system and what is deemed, who determines what is deemed as intelligence, and just the different stories that, the different paths that students go throughout their lives in the education system, and how they're able to be supported in that. Um, And to do that, we're going to actually talk about three different documentaries that go through the education system. Um, yeah, I think we wanted to start with our personal experiences and I guess connecting to time, we wanted to talk about something that affected us all very greatly was the ACTs and SATs. Um, and their effect on us as students growing up and how I think it continues this notion of white supremacy. Um, but yeah, I don't know if someone wants to chime in.
I could start by talking about it a bit for me. We came up with the idea of discussing our experiences with these tests because they've really factored into some of the documentaries we watched. Um, and this idea of time and standardized testing in education and how it contributes to sort of the white supremacy and the normative culture. I graduated high school in 2013, so I took the SAT and the ACT probably in 2012, I would guess. Maybe like early spring 2013, but I have a feeling it was 2012. I don't remember a ton. I do remember taking the practice tests for both of those at my high school, like on a weekend, which sucked. It was probably not, it was optional, but I'm sure my parents were like, it's not optional for you. And the thing I remember most about that was I didn't do super well in the SATs. I got like at the time, the SATs were out of 2400. Now they're out of 1600 again. But at the time, they were out of 2400. I got a 1580, which translates to like a 66%. I don't know if that's how people judge those scores, but like normally a 66% on a test is not good. Um, on my ACT, I got a 26 and then I retook the class and or the test and got a 27. And I remember my dad was he was pissed because he wanted me to do a prep class or like get one of those test prep books. And I didn't want to. And I was sort of, I don't even think I was conscious of the fact that those tests were kind of a game. I was just like, if I know it, I know it. If I don't, I don't. Like, I don't know. I don't want to spend more time. I took a practice test. I think it's better to get a good night's sleep before than to, study. And I raised my score a point and he was mad because I did that without doing anything. Um, but the above average range on the ACT is like 25 to 36, and I got my final score was a 27. And I only retook it because he really wanted me to. I would have been happy with the 26 and not wanted to retake it. But my dad, I live in Marin County. I grew up in Marin County. My dad grew up in Marin County, very white, very affluent. He went to a private high school, and he went to UC Davis. So for him, success, education, grades, like all of those very standard normative things are what he was used to and how he saw success for me and my sister in terms of how we did in school, of, thinking that if you have below a B, then you're not doing enough to fix it. Um, so that was sort of my experience with those tests, and I don't remember a lot of the specifics, but thankfully haven't impacted me too much up till now. So that's something.
Yeah. And I know Danny also has some insight, because that was great insight on just like some of the student side. And I know Danny also has great insight on the counselor side. So we'd like to hear you.
Yeah, so I took the SAT and the ACT back my junior year in 2010 and also my senior year in 2011. I did it through my program. I was part of the Puente program, similar to Avid program. And I I took it, I think the first time I ever took it was in sophomore year, which I took the pre-test. And then I ended up taking my SAT. It was not a good score. I don't remember my score, but I know it was really, really bad. And so I ended up taking it again my senior year. Took it again my senior year. It didn't really improve that much. I also didn't study for it. I was like, whatever about it. And my counselor at the time, she pushed me to take the ACT instead. And I took the ACT, and through my ACT, I actually ended up getting well enough scores, especially my English portion, to the point where I fulfilled my A through G's of English for college. So I didn't have to take English in college, which is really cool. Um, and from that experience, I learned that I'm not exactly sure what is the basis of this, but I was told that sometimes students do better on the ACT than they do on the SAT. So if your scores keep being low on the SAT, you should probably take the ACT instead, which is why I got pushed to take the ACT. And like I said, I don't really know what are the factors to that. That is just something I learned back when I was doing part of it. And then one of the big differences I see now working as a counselor, especially with seniors this year, is that through the pandemic, the through the pandemic, schools decided to drop the SAT and ACT as a requirement for you to be able to go into colleges. So now, after the pandemic, all schools have essentially continued to say that they are dropping it as part of their admission statuses or admission process. And so the students no longer need to take the SAT and ACT in order to apply to colleges. It is an option now. If they decide to take it, they can go ahead and submit those scores, and then those scores help them for placement. If they don't take the ACT, then each university has their own system of assessments where they have to take like essentially like smaller tests when they finally decide what school they're going to go to, and then the school will tell them what are the classes that they need to take through their A through G's. And if a kid does or does not take the ACT or ACT, it does not hurt them in any way for their admission to the school.
And I really wish that that was how it was when I was going to school, because from my own experience, my entire career, basically, especially once I got to high school, I knew that my test score was going to be the thing that held me back from getting into the schools that I wanted. That's just something that I always remember now, kind of getting back into that mindset, thinking about. And I remember telling people, I'm not gonna like the thing that's gonna hold me back is these test scores. And I felt like in school and even outside of school, I took like community college classes in high school because I wanted to be able to compensate for my own setbacks with these tests, to still prove that I'm able to do things and that I'm smart. Because I was able to get A's in these college classes my like sophomore year of high school, but then junior year, which I'm still was taking college classes, but it was like I was doing so poorly on both tests, even with, and I had classes. But now looking back, I'm like, I think it was such a waste of money, and the classes I was in were not appropriate for my sense of learning and like I didn't learn anything in those classes, which it's like that was just like such a waste of money.
Like prep classes.
Yeah, I did prep classes for both ACT and SAT. They weren't like one-on-one, but they were still prep classes. And kind of going off to Danny and I, like we'd already talked about this, but just how, because I was also told, if you're not doing well on the SAT, which I wasn't, take the ACT. I took the ACT and I did just as bad. My scores were basically around the same on both. They were both bad. They were both on the lower whatever. Or at least for I mean now I'm like what is bad? Like I don't know what my standard is, but at the time it wasn't the best score. It wasn't 100% or it wasn't 90%. It probably wasn't even 80%. And that and it took this grad program, I think, to realize that I'm not stupid based off that test, which is so upsetting that it took till this point because I just always felt that because I didn't have this certain kind of brain, like I wasn't intelligent and that I couldn't be intelligent. And it took, yeah, go like paying money to get this further education to learn that, and it's just I won't be like it's dysphoric, but it's just like odd. It's a little like how everything comes together.
Yeah. And I think we'll kind of, as we go through this today, talk about these different perceptions and how there are like certain academic benchmarks that as a society we expect, like if I don't hit that, I'm not smart. I'm not or I'm not good enough to do this, or I have to overcompensate to prove something. Like this idea of like, look at, I can do this, I'm not stupid, when I think we've also really learned so far in this program that there are so many ways schooling is set up that, you know, you can be highly intelligent, but if you're not good at the system of schooling or the system of test taking,
Mhm.
then on paper you don't appear to be intelligent. And that's one of the things that I didn't realize about school when I was a kid, because I liked school. And even the subjects I wasn't very good at, I still tried pretty hard. So to me, I was like, well, yeah, I have a C in geometry, which makes sense. I'm not that good at math, but I have an A in English and I'm good at English. And I very much bought into that stereotypical system of, this is how it is and this is the number that defines you. And I was told the same thing that both of you were. If you're not good at the SAT, do the ACT. And I did much better on the ACT. And I was like, okay, this makes sense. Like what I'm being told lines up. And then I just did the math because I have no idea how they score these things. I got a 27 out of 36 on the ACT. That's a 75%, but it's in the above average. So this idea of what is average, what is normal, what is above is just like completely fake.
Yeah. I don't know if this was the same for you all when y'all took the SAT and ACT, but I know for me, I remember once like we hit that spot where everybody was taking the SAT, ACT, it all became about your number. Like that was all people talked about. Like, what did you get? What number are you? Oh my God, I'm smarter than you because I got this. And like, oh my God, I can't believe that you got this. And I remember like me who like I was like going through a lot during high school. Like I was going through mental health issues and all these other things. Like I wasn't focusing on school because I was focusing on just life. And so I felt really dumb compared to my like the people around me. And there were people around me that I'd been with since kindergarten. So like when we started in elementary school, like I was always one of the students who was like above my grade in terms of English and math. And then it went to like I was in being placed in remedial classes, but then there are other people who were being questioning why I was in remedial classes. But just the fact that I was in those classes and like then looking at my scores that weren't the best, like it made me feel like, why am I even trying to go to college? Like colleges are not even gonna accept me. Like colleges want this number. I can't even hit half of that number. Why would I even try? So it became really like disheartening, that process of like actually trying to get into college, and like it forced my counselor to force me to do it.
Mhm.
Because I was really just like, there's no point for me to even try.
Yeah, I think the high school I went to was super academically driven. And also,
Mm,
like, everyone took a ton of AP classes. And most of my friends were the kids who took every AP possible. I only took English APs because I was like, I'm good at English. I like English. And then I would get like a three on the AP composition test and be like, a three, which is a perfectly good score. I'd be like, shouldn't I have done better than a three? You can get up to a five. A three doesn't even really exempt you from anything in college, which is not why I took the class in the first place. I took it because I wanted a challenge and it was the only subject I wanted. I felt like I needed a challenge in. But it's, yeah, this sort of comparison game where we're comparing ourselves against ourselves, but then also the people around us. And it becomes the whole thing of like, did you hear that she didn't even get a whatever? Or even getting into colleges, like it just becomes like you make yourself feel bad. And then everyone around you is also obsessed with these things. So like it like creates such a negative energy.
And you're either on this like stress rampage all of high school thinking about these numbers and your grades. Even in middle school, I remember like being stressed out because my PE grade was like not an A, and because that's what it was. Just like I was like, I'm not going to get into a good school because my middle school, even though those don't mean anything, but that's what we were all told, or at least, yeah, I think most of us. So it's like you're either in this thing, or like Danny, what you were saying, it's like, or you give up, or you don't give a fuck, like you don't give an F, and you're focusing on your life, and you're like, I can't even attempt this like monster of stress and added stuff to life. I'm just gonna deal with my other things and not even worry about that because it's so much added stress that's not necessary for a child. Like, we're children. And if you're already, like we've talked about, there's already this assumption that everyone is like starting at this level and has this like perfect little life when they go home and then can come to school and learn their little mathematics when it's like, don't yell at a kid for falling asleep. There's a reason they're falling asleep in your classroom. And I remember the first time I had actually a math teacher, there was someone sitting next to me falling asleep, and my little like rule follower like head, I was like, why is that like that's bad that person's falling asleep, da da da. And I thought my teacher was gonna like yell at them because that's what had always happened in the past. And my teacher like looked at them, looked at me, and said, I'm gonna let them sleep. Like they need it if they're sleeping right now. And that was the first time that I was really like, oh, like, they're like that there's a reason that they're so tired. Like what's going on at home? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're staying up all night playing video games, which is might be like the assumption. Um, so yeah, let's move on. Now we're going to kind of get into some of the documentaries that we watched. The first one that we watched was Waiting for Superman. It was directed by Davis Guggenheim in 2010. And the cameras follow several families and their own struggles with the education system. A lot of it specifically, I think, almost follows the parents a little bit more and what they have to go through to get their kid into basically a good school, quotes, since I don't know if we're gonna have recording or not. Um, and basically that there's this discrepancy between schools and that just historically money, a lot of money is thrown at schools, and as we've learned more at the people on top, more of like the powerful people, that's where the money is thrown. But a lot of money over the years has, over time, over generations, has been given to schools more and more. But this documentary explains that nothing, it's on, kids are getting worse, kids are getting more dumb. And it's overall a critique of the school system, and um that they're big, this is what we need to do is charter schools, and that these lotteries are almost the answer. And while we found this documentary interesting, I think it highlighted a lot of different things. It also, I think, through a 2024 lens, looking at charter schools and now the problems with, if there's only who is making the decisions within these charter schools. And in this documentary, they have Ree, who is this new superintendent who comes in for Washington, D.C., and wants to change everything and raise these test scores. But it comes out, like I said, in 2020, or at this point, I think it was 2018, it comes out that all these test scores were actually inflated, and that they were the teacher evals were based on test scores, and it made it people were getting fired a lot quicker based on these test scores. And this movie kind of made it seem like charter schools and this her way of programming was working, when really it was all based on poor statistics. Um, and I think something that I was thinking about was how I think we all want the same thing with schools. Like, no one wants there to be bad schools and for the kids not to have a proper education. But I think that she was looking at the wrong tool or the wrong instrument. Like, she in her, in a lot of people's heads too, I think it's like the teachers are the problem, or the school specifically, or the state. And I mean, that's why she ended up closing so many schools, because they weren't good schools, when really I think a lot of it has to do with the testing, as we've talked about, and how like this whole documentary was based, at least majority of it was based on test scores are going down, we need to raise them up. But as we've talked about, test scores aren't a true dictator of intelligence. And as we talked about with time, and we'll talk about that more, but basically, we know that having this with testing, there's this time aspect where you have to finish it in a certain amount of time. You have to do this essay in a certain amount of time. You have to study in class so you can do this test in a certain amount of time. And they talk about this in Waiting for Superman a little bit. But how do these time constraints influence student performance and then their own perceptions of success?
So in the documentary, kind of our next one, The Test and the Art of Thinking, it's from 2018. It was directed by Michael Arlen Davis. And this one is, perfectly fits in with that same question about time constraints, because this documentary is about test taking, and more specifically, the SAT and college entrance tests. And they mentioned the ACT a few times, but it really is focused on the SAT and the industry that has been built around the SAT, and sort of like the mythology of it. So sort of the through lines are the SAT is about how you think, not what you know. And this idea that it's not a math test, it's not a reading test, it's a get the answer test. And so they talk to, or the documentarians interview teenagers, who have take about how they feel about the SAT, and how the SAT, like what pressure it creates for them. One kid says something like, "It's me against the Scantron. Like this score determines if I'm gonna have a good future." And they also talk to SAT tutors, like, people whose whole careers and lives are about prepping kids to take the SAT, college professors, admissions officers, people who work for the companies that make the tests. And this discussion about standardized testing more specifically as like a college entrance exam and the history of everyone taking the same college entrance exam, which was supposed to be equitable and merit based and has become extremely privilege based, is it leads to this examination of deeper issues in the educational system. Is something like the SAT a good measure of academic success and intelligence? Like we were just saying, test scores are not the one thing that defines intelligence. Should this test, the SAT, factor heavily into college admissions? Should it determine the future of a student? And then does it or should it impact how high school teachers teach and even teachers before high school and middle and elementary? And this was 2018, so at the time, we still live very much in a society that revolved around the SAT. Obviously now it's a lot different, but at the time it was still very much like, this tutor that they had who was saying like, it's about efficiency. It's here are the tricks, here are the convoluted tricks we use to answer the questions as fast as possible. So that one was really about, I feel like you cannot talk about those tests without talking about time, because it truly is like gamified of how you like part of the like how do you get the best score is like how fast can you be, how much can you get done. At one point, the history of the test, you got like a penalty for not answering questions, which I don't believe is the case anymore, but that's one of the things that they talk about. So it reminded me a lot of the article, Cripping Time, and also Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, which we can talk about later. But that was the test and the art of thinking.
And then the last documentary we all watch is Most Likely to Succeed, which is it came out in 2019 by Pamela Lifke. And the documentary actually started back in 2007. They chose four different students from different backgrounds. They chose two Black students and two white students, and they followed them throughout the next 10 years of their life. And the reason why they chose Most Likely to Succeed is because all of these four students went to different high schools, and they were all voted as most likely to succeed their senior year. And so because of that, they were chosen for this documentary. And through the documentary, we just get to experience like what happens after they graduate. So they follow them through college, and really from the beginning, you get to see not only like the how time is involved, but also privilege is involved as well. You get to see who are the students who kind of had this idea of what they thought the next 4 years of their life was going to be, and who actually accomplished it, and then who found that it wasn't as easy, or it wasn't going to be the road that they actually took. Unfortunately, the documentary did do a little bit of stereotypical things where it was the Black students who came from poor communities. Their family situation was not the best, while the white students came from middle class. Their family situation seemed to be more or less fairly okay, where they didn't really need to think too much about their family as they went into college. And we just get to see them experience what college is. They talk about what they like, what they don't like, the disappointments that they had. And because it is a 10-year, we also follow them into the adult time that they have as well. Right off the bat, one of Quay, she is a Black student from Detroit. She like her mom had heart attacks. So she had to put her education on the back burner to really support her mother. So she did not graduate within the first 4 years. The other three students did graduate within those 4 years, and they went ahead and then moved on to kind of seeing what happened after, right? There was Disco. He's also a Black student from Detroit. And then we kind of get to see how his relationship impacted his life. Like we see how his involvement with alcohol also affected his life. And we get to see also how his trajectory was not the trajectory he started with when he was 18. That was not where he ended when he was, 21. And then we get to see also the stories of all of them who more or less at the end of the documentary, they kind of talk about what is success for them, right? And each individual has a different description of what success is for them. What I found really interesting is that for none of these, like, was it money? None of them was like necessarily having this high paying career. For a lot of them, like there was different things that meant success, and it seemed like a lot of what they took to be success really came down to like the experiences they had in their community, right? And that kind of got me thinking about communities of practice and situated learning, which we'll talk more about. But it's definitely like an interesting idea of seeing how not only does the time within school, your school years really affect you, but also it really affects after school, right? And like what your life really looks like. And there's this concept still of time, right? A lot of them mentioned like, I want to do this, this, and this by this age. And some of them were able to do it, and some of them were not. And like, you see them struggling with the idea of like, by this time, I should have done this, or by this time, I actually did do all of this stuff, right? And how that kind of plays into their confidence and plays into how they feel about themselves and how successful they truly were.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Both of your, both, well, not both of your, but Waiting for Superman and Most Likely to Succeed did follow the trajectories, the stories of some specific students. Whereas the Test and the Art of Thinking, like one or two kids that they did check in on a few times, but it was more overarching. And I think it's so interesting. There's so much when you really get that snapshot to follow a student. Waiting for Superman, it didn't, the timing wasn't super clear, but it seemed like a few months versus Most Likely to Succeed 10 years. Is like you really learn a lot more about the different ways that the educational system can impact someone, and how that course can go. And then the Test documentary looked more at like this overall, like this thing that affects everyone. It almost makes me wonder, like it'd be so interesting to find out like the test taking process for those four kids and Most Likely to Succeed, and their scores, and they all got into schools that they were proud to get into, even if one of them didn't end up going to the school. But I think that's interesting too. And like, if we had to guess, I'm sure the two white kids and Most Likely to Succeed might have had some SAT prep, whereas the other two probably didn't.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason that Quay didn't go to that school that they really wanted to go to, one that probably was deemed more rigorous or whatever, was because she couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
Where all the other people were able to go.
Disco had that scholarship.
Yeah, Disco had the scholarship, and I'm sure Quay did too, but you can't always get all of it covered.
Mhm.
I know
Plus,
Peter and Sarah, both of their families supported them throughout their college. Both of them kind of
Neither,
talked
I mean,
about not having to go into debt.
yeah,
yeah,
they
no,
didn't.
you're right.
I feel like for Peter and Sarah, the two white kids, it wasn't about how am I going to make this work, or how, like Disco kind of had to support himself because his adoptive parents basically weren't around. Like he had to really have the motivation. For them, it was more like the beginning of it was social. Like for Peter, it was very much like social and like how do I, meet people and what do I want to study? Do I want to go into teaching? Do I not? And I feel like for Quay and Disco, it was both more like, how do I support myself? How do I make this happen? Um, like I just felt like they had a lot more weighing on them
Well,
because of the lack of privilege.
yeah, I mean, Disco just from the beginning, it's like when he graduated, he was said like I was born addicted to drugs. Like that's already a lot to start with to know that your parents couldn't take care of you and
Mhm.
then not having much support would make it a lot harder. I was gonna kind of connect what Danny was talking about earlier with success and what success means and the paths, the roads people go. I think it would have been interesting if they followed some of the kids from Waiting for Superman longer, that like they did for Most Likely to Succeed. Because one of our critiques that we were talking about with that documentary or movie was that it puts a lot of emphasis on charter schools and that charter schools are kind of this end all be all when in reality we know that that might not necessarily be the case, but it's I would be interested to know what these parents who are pushing their kids into these certain schools for their kids' benefit, what success means for them, and if success is ultimately over if they don't get into these, like what's gonna happen? What do parents think is gonna happen to their children if they can't get into these like charter schools? Um,
I feel like there was something in Waiting for Superman that one of the parents said that Quay also said in Most Likely to Succeed of like, good education is the difference between a job and a career. And the parent who said that in Waiting for Superman was I think Bianca's mom. She was the black girl and the mom was a single mom and was paying for her daughter to go to a Catholic school but eventually couldn't afford it. And I think that that's a huge thing too. And someone briefly mentioned it in the test taking documentary as well. Like there were a few students of color interviewed who said, my parents want to invest in me because they want me to have more than I did, but like, am I even a good investment? And this idea of time and money and resources and, what, like, Bianca and Daisy were the two kids in Waiting for Superman who didn't get into the charter schools. And then I think it was Anthony and I forget the other girl's name. There are two kids who ended up getting in and two who didn't, right? Or were there five? And it would be interesting, yeah, to see like only one of the kids that was a charter high school, the white girl from Silicon Valley. The rest, I think, was probably like a K through 8, maybe, or maybe even a K through 12. But it would be interesting to see the kids who got in, the kids who didn't at the end, maybe all of them at the end of their K through 12 career, where they ended up. Like, because there was sort of that undertone in Waiting for Superman with the one girl, Daisy, who wanted to be a veterinarian. Like, kind of the undertone was like, if she can't get into this charter school, she probably isn't, her motivation's going to stall out and she probably will never make it very far.
or she won't be able to take the right math classes to get into it.
Yeah,
Because I
like
think they
she
talk
won't,
about that a bit too, that she's gonna get tracked.
yeah, that she, like, the tracking will kind of even make it harder for her to get onto the level that she could very well be successful at. And I think that brings up that huge idea um, that was really present in the Metaphors We Live By reading by Lakoff about time is money. And this idea, the metaphor of time is money, is, time is a limited resource, time is a valuable commodity. And when you have time and you have money, when you have resources, you have more options, and your definition of success is probably more attainable.
And broad. I think that it can be, yeah, because I think with the Disco and Quay, their, I think, version of success a lot of it is just like being stable, being all right, having community where these other people have just more, it could be more broad because they have so many more resources and they have more at their disposal, at their fingertips. So that makes, and even I think both of the white people were saying like success had nothing to do with money. And not that the other people, not that Quay and Disco said that it did, but money does make it easier, but the other people, it's like they've always had that support and money. So that isn't in their realm of success because I think that's already like a given that they're gonna have that.
It's easy to say money isn't everything when that's not a concern you have. Yeah.
when
Yes.
you have it already.
I had a student today, one of my seniors, she was looking at different things. She got into UCSB and she was looking at different things, and she comes from a single mom family, and she's um applying for scholarships. She's like, wait, I don't want to go to college anymore. This is expensive. Like all the excitement of getting into these great schools for her gets totally dimmed by the fact she's like, wait, why is dining more than housing? Like, what is all of this?
Hmm. Yeah. Um, Going back to like Caroline, what you said about like metaphors, right? And like that metaphor of time is money. I think it's really interesting to see like how that metaphor we conceptualize what success is, but we also conceptualize how we like structure our entire education system, right? Because we see that throughout these documentaries, we're looking at different ages. We go from like elementary, middle school to high school to like college and like adulthood. And we realize how there is this concept of money being the thing that drives us to do things quickly, right? Like even going back to Mia's initial question of like, how is time like these limits on these tests and all of this, like that tells you like that kind of prepares us for like what we now see at our jobs of being like, I need you to do this thing in a week and I need you to get this in by the end of the day. And like we need to do things fast. Like we can't take an entire year focusing on one project. Like we need to get this done and like get it moving so that we can go on to the next thing. And then that just brings like capitalism into it and like this idea of like we don't got time to stop. Like you need to go through and like find the loopholes to like look like go through things a lot faster. And we see that a lot in when they were talking about the SAT, like the the coach. He literally says that he's like, it's not about knowledge. It's literally about using the skills to get things faster. Like it's about you need to get through each I think what did he say? Like you have like a minute for each question.
It was truly like, here's the strategy, like here's the cheat code for the game, like what, you want to get more money in Sims? Well, you press these keys.
Yep. And then at the end, they also talked about back when the SAT was part of the admission process, like it was also part of the financial part, right? Like universities took these numbers that you got on the SAT and then through that would then decide how much money they would offer you in your package. And so not only did it become like this metaphor, but it actually became real where like really time did mean money because if you took too much time in one question, that meant one less question that you can answer, which means less points that you can get, which means less money that you can get from this college that you're trying to get into, but you don't have the money and the resources to pay for yourself to actually be able to go because it's too damn expensive for all of us to be able to go to these institutions. And then it became a reality where it was no longer just a metaphor, but it was truly like it was like 1 point did mean money. And like even the one of the parents, he said, he's like, well, we know that 50 points more equates to more money, but what's the system? Like no one really knows the system. We just know the more points, the more money, but we don't really know how much does each point awards you. It could be $50, it could be $100, it could be $1,000. We don't know.
It's all fake. None of it's real.
And I think too,
Thanks,
going
babe.
going back to yeah, this idea of financial aid and your testing these points having to do with the money. Well, first, I think from the beginning, just with the inception of capitalism, time is money, like minimum wage, every hour that passes, you're making money or whatever. Your company's losing money because they're giving it to you. And it just looking at test scores for everything ignores the intersectionality of people and of students. And going back to what we are talking about with Crip Time, which is people who have different disabilities basically need a little bit more time to do things, are not within this like white supremacy standard of how long it should take for you to take a test. And to ignore for these financial aid offices to ignore that and ignore honestly disability. And I even like my brother got money from a class action lawsuit because he wasn't given the proper accommodations when he took the ACT. Because I think that they weren't, I mean, we can look it up, but I don't think that they were open about how to get them, who could get them. And my brother has diagnosed autism and didn't have any accommodations. And that's a problem. And for that to be connected to how much money you're going to get to go to school, it's like if you don't have, if you can't fit into the standard, you're not going to get money and you can't go to school. But then ultimately, too, as we've talked about, the UC system was built on taking native land and trying to like make workers for capitalism. So it's just like education is good and we all should go. Sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but yeah, I think it just a lot of it boils down to capitalism and like we said, time truly equating money under the stage we're at, and that ignores all the different kinds of people, which is what the school system does. The school system ignores that the variety of, I mean, the tests, even the SATs, kind of going off of the second documentary, the, what is it? The active,
Or it's the test and the art of thinking.
yes, going off of the test of the art of thinking, the one of the college board, the people who make the test are all like older white men and assumed that it was based off of merit. They were like, we found the thing that is purely based on merit. But if they had brought anyone else onto their team, or if they like were not where they stood in society, they would understand that that makes no sense and that a test alone can't determine someone's merit. As they even said, they were like, money, background, it doesn't make a difference with this test.
I feel like it's this idea of the normative culture, like when we say time is money, and you brought up minimum wage, your education also depends on what kind of job you can get. If you have the time, when you're prepping for the SAT, you get into a better school, you may never have to have a minimum wage job. And I think that that's also the thing when we talk about these intersections and talk about like all the old white dudes making the test, it brings back in that idea from Crip Time of like any intersection, like if you're not white and able-bodied, like this idea of the different things that you can and can't have access to in society. And I think this idea of Crip Time, I don't know if we even fully defined it, but it's basically that concept that it refers to the flexibility outside of the normative approach. And much of our society, in Wood's kind of, I'm sort of paraphrasing Woods from that article. Much of society is based on deadlines and normative timeframes, and we expect students to arrive at those benchmarks in those timeframes, just like we expect people to arrive at those benchmarks in society. And crip time is about having more flexibility. It's about having, the understanding that everyone gets somewhere at their own pace. 3 of the people in Most Likely to Succeed graduated in 4 years. Quay was finally getting her bachelor's at the end of that 10 years. And it's just, I don't know, I just think it's really interesting to even look at this idea too of the normative, and it creates this like white, able-bodied, up middle class to upper middle class, like all these different things that all look like the people who make the test. And everyone who doesn't get included, whether that's someone with a disability, it could be ADHD, it could be someone who is blind, it could be someone who is Latino or Native American or Filipino, like when none of those people are included, it's almost like that one reading from Jonathan's class where the standard was white and every other group was measured by that standard. And it didn't even say white in the statistics, it said majority. Like, this is where you got to be. Oh, you're below that? Not good enough.
And that makes me think of um going back to the test and the act of thinking, how a lot of these questions, like the SAT was not like it wasn't just like, okay, we made this test and then that's the test we're giving for the next 50 years. Like they were constantly updating this test and like quote unquote making it better. And then through each one, there was one time where in the film where the head of college board was talking about how like they contextualize the um they contextualized the questions so that students could really like make sense. It wasn't about tricking kids anymore. It was really about making it so that they could understand. Um, but that also makes me think of like, well, who are you making this contextual to? Like, are you like including examples, ideas, words, phrases, names that correlate with POCs? Like, like, or do we have just a bunch of white names here? Do we have a bunch of situations that don't really mimic the lives of people of color in the United States, right? Because if it doesn't, then you're still not contextualizing it for the majority of the students who really desperately need to get these answers because they're the ones who don't have the money, right? And obviously not saying that like all white folks have money, but you are like really putting still into this back pocket a bunch of students who are really depending on this test for their future. And to like, not only is it an opportunity, but it's really like they need to go to school in order to get a career, in order to get a better job, to really support their family. Um, and if all you have is a bunch of like older white men making these corrections and making this test better, then who like are you really including like POC into that? Like, can I actually see? Because when I think back to the ACT, I mean, it was like a few years back, but I I do remember that it was like, I don't understand this. Why am I just seeing like a bunch of Johns and Sarahs and like, all these names? I'm like, why can't I see a Maria? Why can't I see a Jose? Like, why can't I see like, like those type of questions and those type of situations, and even the essay portion, it's talking about US Anglo white Western history. It's not talking about like, tell me about how Mexicans portrayed like Mexicans did gave to this country. Tell me about the annexation of this land that used to be Mexico and how that happened. It was never that. It was always like, tell me about George Washington. Like, you know about George Washington. We have an entire day for him. Like, you know?
Well, and when you say like they're making it better, the immediate question for me is better for who?
And what about all the people before? I think we talked about that too. All the people who took the test and either lost their financial aid because the test sucked or weren't able to go to the school because once again the test sucked. It's like what they they need to apologize. They need to pay for school. Like they need to do something because it's like you can't just like you can't just do something that changes people's lives so drastically and be like, whoops, like we messed up a little bit, but now it's better when they didn't do anything different from the last time they made the test. And if they know that this test is like a game,
Can't change the rules. Like Danny said, the guy in his speech said, we're not trying to trick them anymore. Okay, so what about all the kids you were trying to trick for the last 40 years?
and then what if it's the language is written in a way where it is predominantly contextualized for white people, for the whatever standard, it's gonna the other people who aren't in that standard, it's not gonna be easy for, it's not gonna be contextualized for, or it's gonna be harder to do better. And so
Mhm.
it's not based on merit at all.
And this, like, that entire conversation just makes me think back to Gutierrez and Ragov's article, The Cultural Ways of Learning, Individual Traits and Repertoires of Practices, where we like talk about communities of practices, and we're talking about how, like, we all learn in these pockets in which, like, as individuals, we share interest, we share background, and also that it's very much linked to our culture, right? Like, I learned a lot of just the initial, and even now, a lot of what I learned is through the cultural ways that I got taught, like testimonios, and like, which are, like, stories being told verbally, not being told in a written statement. So I can verbally tell you so much more than what I can write because I learned to talk. I didn't learn to write. And so I think that in itself, like, this idea of like we're placing the norm as, or the majority as, white culture, white folks, we're basically like stunting anybody else whose community of practices was not rooted in like the, white capitalist or whatever society. Like, all of that is being thrown into, you know, the side. And those students aren't really able to showcase like how truly intelligent they are. It's just their intelligence comes from a different way, right? That like school deems it to be like, oh, that makes you smart. Well, no, that just makes me smart because I'm thinking in the way that you want me to think. That's not smartness. That's just I'm following your rules. But for all of those who don't follow that, like, we're placing this thing of like, well, you're not smart enough because you can't get this big number in this big test. But it's like, but that test was not created for me, like, in any shape or form.
In Waiting for Superman, and this idea that students who are not within this like one what as we've talked about, who isn't just this white able-bodied cis person, are because the tests, as we've talked about, aren't made for them, don't do as well. And then with those standardized tests and just any other tests that they don't not contextualized for them. They think that like in Waiting for Superman, they're like these kids are told so early that this isn't set up for them and that they're not smart, that they can't do it. And it's just like just thinking about that is heartbreaking. And I know that even in my own, as we talked about, like I have felt that way, but I just can't even imagine from when you're young to when you're older or dropping out or whatever, you're just constantly being told like because you can't perform on this test, like you're not going anywhere. You can't do anything. And that's just really upsetting. That's like how can you how can adults every single day like t like and I know it's obviously like jobs whatever. Like it's not I'm not saying like it's anyone's fault, but it's just like telling kids that they're like admissions people or whoever that their worth is based on this like score. And I know you guys are, I mean, counselor and teacher, so I think it's like interesting. And I've always felt like I've always been anti-grades. Not like obviously always, but once I was like had a aha moment and I was like, this shouldn't be who I am. But as like a high schooler or a middle schooler, whatever, it's really, really, really hard to say that it's the system's fault and not yours. That you like it's too easy to say that it's your fault and that you're just stupid. Um, and that can, I mean, I want Caroline to be able to talk, but that goes into the prison pipeline, and how if you're told your whole life that you're not gonna, that I mean, you're doing bad on these tests and that these teachers don't want to accommodate you and your learning styles and you're just othered your whole life and then you drop out of school, not obviously everyone, but it would be a lot easier to drop out of school because you're not able to, the system doesn't make it able so you can continue. And then a lot of those people are also disabled and have whatever, ADHD and can't focus in a certain way. And maybe that's why they were kicked out of the classroom or whatever. And then you go to prison and then you're a slave. I'm so like slavery is still legal in the prison system. And so now you're working for like McDonald's and making cups and just making the rich people richer. And they benefit from this happening. They benefit from pushing kids out of schools, them dropping out and going to prison. Like the for profit. And I think that's scary. I know that it's not like obviously like the school systems aren't working with like whatever, like that's a huge conspiracy that obviously isn't happening, but it's like they're still all working together to perpetrate the system. That's a problem.
Mia's comment really brought a quote from Gutierrez, like how you were talking about how like from like the get-go, there's already this preconception of like the system is not for you, like you're not even gonna go through the system, so why even bother kind of thing. And where he's talking about like the style and how learning styles are sometimes connected to culture, which shouldn't be. And he talks about the quote is within a styles approach, a single way of teaching and learning may be used with a particular group without accounting for individuals' past experiences with certain practices or without providing instructions that both extends those experiences and introduces new and even unfamiliar ways of doing things. And this just shows how like, right, like we all come from these very unique communities and then we're kind of thrown into a education system that essentially from K to 12 pretty much looks the same. Like everywhere, like whether you're going public, private, or charter, like it's pretty much the same thing. And that system doesn't work for everybody, right? And like when there's these misconceptions that oh you're Mexican, well I already know that this is going to be your trajectory. Oh, you're black, okay, I already know this is going to be your trajectory. Like you're Asian, okay, I already know I can push you. And like we're going into all these misconceptions and all of these stereotypes. Like what chance does a 5-year-old kid who all they know is like, I want to work with animals and I want to be a vet one day, like, how can they fight that when the adults are in control of their trajectory through choosing their classes, through tracking, through all these things? Like, they're already placed in a disadvantage because they have no choice of where they start off. Um, and once they've started off, all they can do is try to catch up. But by the time they try to catch up, it's like it's so hard when you also have all these thousands of things happening in your personal life, in your family life, financially, all of this stuff. Like it's so hard to actually try to beat the system that it's built to see you fail.
And to tell you it's your fault too. It's like, why, oh, it's my fault, so I can't even, what can I even do? You know, it's like you're already at a, like, what is a 5-year-old to do? And then it's like, what is, and what is a parent supposed to do in that case too? You know, there's like, unless your family can sue, and we talk about this in the disability class, it's like, if your family is perceived to have money, they'll do something because they legally have to. But if they aren't perceived to have money, they won't because they don't have to be scared about getting sued, which is just like really scary, especially for like IEPs, specifically. But that's a whole nother conversation.
What Danny just said actually really works with what I was gonna originally talk about, because you talked more about culture and different things that are valued in different cultures, and Mia was saying like what do you do if the system isn't built for you? And that's the thing that I think was so important with the Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, is that there are tons of different types of intelligence. Everyone has a different makeup, like no two people are the same. And his whole thing with multiple intelligences was the standard measure, the Western measure of intelligence, is an IQ test, which really only tests the linguistic and logical mathematical intelligences. And the reason that he doesn't put any stock in that, he doesn't really trust it, is because it doesn't account for all the other types of intelligences. There's like spatial intelligence, there's naturalist, musical intelligence, there's intrapersonal and interpersonal, and all these different types of intelligences. And because young people are really flexible, they're still developing all their intelligences. And, you know, Howard Gardner was even very briefly featured in the Test in the Art of Thinking documentary, calling the SAT a souped up IQ test. And like, you know, he's not a fan of the IQ test. Um, and so I just think it's interesting too, because if the culture you come from, the intelligences that are prioritized are the intelligences that are used the most, and maybe even to a certain point, like genetically more developed, because part of what goes into multiple intelligences is evolution. Certain cultures, this musical intelligence is more innate. But if school only really measures linguistic and the logical mathematical, you're not given the opportunity to grow that intelligence, to show off what you can do,
To get
um,
challenged in that way.
get challenged, to succeed and to push yourself. You know, you get tracked lower because you don't have that one intelligence, and then suddenly you're written off. And it's the same thing. I think Danny even kind of mentioned learning styles too, and how those are so culturally based. And I think that this idea of the learning styles and the multiple intelligences, like if your culture is very social and it makes sense for you to like yell things out in class and you learn very socially, and that was a huge part of that Rogoff article as well, as learning together and those communities of practice. If your home culture is very much like that, you go into the way that most schools are designed and you're seen as disruptive, loud. You're not smart because you can't put your thoughts down on paper, but you can verbalize them, but no one gives you the chance to verbalize them. Like it truly creates this tiny, narrow path you have to fit into. And what are kids supposed to do about that? What are parents supposed to do about that when they just want their kid to be successful, but they know that, you know, she's got to go to this school so she can take this math class to be successful, and I don't have the time or money. And because time is money and we don't have those things, it's up to this lottery of a charter school of if my kid gets to pursue those intelligences. And we even talked a little bit, I think the other day when we were sort of prepping for this, about how some of those charter schools, the draw is more individualized support, maybe more creative assessments. And sometimes the kids who don't fit the standard mold can really excel in those charter school environments, or at the very least, just get a lot more attention if their class has 20 kids as opposed to the 34 that's the cap in a public school. But if you don't have the money to pay for a charter school, or you
Well,
don't have
they're
the money
free,
to private,
right?
they're free. I mean, sorry, I was
Private
thinking more of
schools?
the Catholic school that the one kid in Waiting for Superman goes to.
Yeah.
Like her mom knew that that would set her up better from like that was elementary, I think, would set her up better for high school. But, time is money. If you don't have it, you don't have it. And then she has to worry about how do I figure out like how do I give my daughter all these potential opportunities when I don't have time and I don't have money. And her hours were getting cut at work. And it was like the literal, I'm not, my job is by the hour and my hours are getting cut. And there's lots of jobs that don't pay by the hour, but you gotta get there, and that's hard.
Mhm.
I just think it's interesting, and Danny, I'm gonna pose a question to you, but I think it's interesting with charter schools and how there was this like pressure to get in, and it's like, how do we even know that that is prepping people, like a charter school specifically is prepping people or prepping kids for this like successful life? Like, is it even worth all this pressure and stress? Like, how much different? Because I mean, we talked about in the beginning, the test scores over time for the charter schools or for RE and her changes to the DC school district didn't do anything. If anything, it made students less like whatever, like they weren't able to perform as well on test scores on tests. And so Danny works at a charter school as a counselor. And yeah, we talked about it a bit earlier and I want to hear, and I think it's very insightful, their information on charter schools.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the hype of charter schools, it kind of just for me, my brain just goes back into Lav's article of teaching as learning and practice, which talks about situated learning, right? Which is a very particular way in which individuals who share common thoughts, common interests, really are able to learn and gain knowledge amongst each other, right? And we also know that like this type of learning also like helps you not only learn like the academic side, but it helps you learn like life skills, social skills, like all of that, right? And I think, the idea of charter schools, the idea of like much smaller, much concentrated, like being able to really hone in on your students, like it sounds really, really good. And I think if you do it well, it can be really, really good, right? Because I just think about my kids, like my senior class is 93 kids. So from like other schools who their senior class is 400 kids, right? As a counselor, it's a struggle to talk to 93 kids every semester. I don't even want to imagine what it would look like if I had to talk to 400 kids. Like I wouldn't be able to, right? And then leads to those experiences that a lot of us have that like throughout high school, we talk to our counselor maybe once or twice, and then that's it because they didn't have the time to give to us, right? And charter schools, they can do that, right? The particular charter school that I work at, I won't be name dropping, but like I think in its principle has a lot of good things, right? There's like a lot of mental health, there's a lot of student support, community support, like we help our parents a lot, not only educational, but like for food, all of these things. Like there's so much support. It's like I like to call it like when you talk about like it takes a village, that's what it feels like. Like it really feels like a village. Like everybody knows everybody. Like all the teachers, all the staff members, all the students know each other. They've grown up with each other. They know each other's brothers and sisters. They're coming, they're going. Like it's so much that it's such this tiny little community that you feel like, cool, like it's so tiny, everybody looks out for each other. And there's really that sense of community. But I do think that sometimes that idea then becomes like, well, how can we support our community to do better, but at the same time, we don't meet the community where they are at, right? And we push for APs, we push for college classes, we push for let's go to UCs, let's go to CSUs, but then we don't actually give them the ability to actually be able to go to these schools, right? I hear a lot about like if my kid goes to a charter school, they're gonna have a lot more rigor because of like what Caroline said, like you have all these different ways to learn that you're being taught, like all these different intelligence are being like met. So that means more rigor, that means more knowledge. But I also think that something that's happening at the school I work at is that there's this notion that our kids are getting rigor and rigor and rigor, but in reality, their rigor is also connected to equity, which is really beautiful. But at the same time, like what equity looks like doesn't really support the student to go into a world that is not based on equity, right? And I think that is super vital. Like when we're talking about equity, equity needs to happen across the board. You can't have equity for like, for your high school, but then go into a college that does not care about equity, that does not follow that they're based on the grade. Like you can't have that, right? Like our school, the way they do equity is like, well, no one gets an F. So everybody just gets an MC, which is a no pass, which means it doesn't affect your GPA, right? Because we know that things happen and sometimes our students don't pass their classes and we don't want to penalize them for that, right? We drop what a C looks like. A C at our school is a 64%. Other schools that's a D, right? Because again, we know that things happen, right? There's no like late policy at our school, right? You can turn in your homework when you get to it, right? And it sounds really great because it's like great. Like we're really trying to hone in on the fact that our students are individuals outside of school. But what that happens is now we're sending them to UC Berkeley where like they don't care about what's going on. They're saying like you need to turn in your homework at this time and if you don't turn it in, you're failing. Like you have a 64, that's a D, that's not a C, right? Like you can't come in, you can't do minimum work and get maximum pay, right? Like you could, like sometimes you can't even get maximum pay by doing maximum work, right? Because we know privilege is a thing. So then we send our kids out, and what we've seen in the last 3 years I've been at this school is that our kids are overwhelmed and they drop out within a semester or within the year, and then they go into community college, which no bad for community college, right? Like that's an amazing route to go through. But I think it's like we're setting up our kids to have this really bad experience at a UC or a CSU. And then their idea of education and just their confidence like dwindles. I see kids who come back and they're like, yeah, I just couldn't make it. And like, it sucks that I couldn't make it. And now I feel dumb. And it's like, you're not dumb. It's just, it's a different world, right? And we didn't prepare you for that world. And as much as we are trying to kind of coddle you and like pretend like everything's gonna be okay, like unfortunately that's not how it works outside. And so then we get those stories of like people who go to charter schools and then like they fix the numbers and they fix the scores and they fix the transcripts to look better, to polish them up. But those aren't actually what is happening, but that is what's being, portrayed to everybody to make charter schools feel like they are better as, the idea of public schooling in America, like, it's going down. Like, we were like, okay, well, public school sucks, so go to charter schools and we're going to actually be able to do the thing. But the system is still the same. The system hasn't changed. Um, and you're not really like, when you change, even if you're changing it within this micro level, like, you're not changing it in the macro level, and the macro level is what's needed more than anything else.
You're not changing society. Society
Mm-hmm.
is going to be, like you said, when they go to Berkeley and, a D is a D, society hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
The way that Danny just sort of wrapped that up is like, it's reality, but we're not saying it's unfixable. We're just saying, like, we need to be looking in the right place to fix it.
And that too, okay. Actually, this is what too I was gonna say, just with the documentary, something that I think we all had issues, or at least I know I really had issues with, was a lot of the documentaries didn't give any call to action. Like the biggest call to action was call this number, or like let's change it. But there's no real, like, even everyday or personal things within our personal lives that we can do to make the system a little bit better or help some people out. So maybe we can go through and just say, like, yeah, something that we think that we can do or that other people can do to make the system just a tiny bit better. It doesn't have to be obviously like instrumental, but maybe as like a teacher, as a counselor, myself as a student or whatever.
Like, I know at my school that I work at, they try to host workshops for FAFSA. And they did that, like, they had a bilingual one in the fall. And we have a community liaison who she will sort of interface with the parents who are not fluent in English.
So what can people do?
They can use their privileges and their resources to benefit others. Like, white privilege happens when you're white, and it just means you've got a foot in the door already. So, what are you doing with that foot in the door? And are you then using that foot in the door to hold the door open for other people?
And I think that goes into what I was thinking that people can do, that we can do, is just being an advocate with what you're saying. It's like the education behind it and understanding how the system works, and then advocating for the students, the helping the parents, just the people in your life. And with this knowledge that you do have, making sure that they aren't getting like tracked, or that they're not getting whatever, or that they're just making sure that they are, I guess, informed about all of the barriers that the school system comes with.
For me, I feel like one of the things that is so important to do is to change education from like money to humanity,
Mm,
right? Because I think even in the way that we talk to students, I know as a counselor, I always talk about like, look, like if you go to college, you'll have more money, you'll have a career. Like it's always this idea of like, well, if you do more, like if you get more educated, you're gonna be able to bring in more money and more revenue. Which is like, we all know money is needed because at the end of the day, it's a capitalist society we live in, and let's be real, we need it.
mhm.
But I also think is adding to that and making it even more important is that going to college it's a full-on experience. Like there's people who find themselves in college, who find their tribe, who find their identity, who really get to understand themselves because they're not limited to this very strict order. And I push for counselors and teachers and people who are going into education that like you look at your student and you don't look at your student as just a student, that you look at them as a person,
Mm.
and that you humanize them in your classes, and that you're not just pushing math because it's math or English because they're English, not because there's the SBAC and this other test that like needs to get done, but rather it's like we're focusing on like our are students conceptualizing this knowledge, and are they actually being able to apply this to their life? Like, people don't understand that they can problem solve because they're in math. And it's like math doesn't have, like, it's not about two plus two. It's about problem solving. It's about the skill that you're gonna then turn to use in your life. And I think that's what needs to happen. Like, the vital part needs to happen. Um, I like I want to share this because I told this to my students recently, and I felt like I even, like, after, I was like, damn, pat in the bag. That was like a really good little thing that you just said to your kids. But my kids are seniors, and they're like, they care about is money. And I was like, like, I understand that, but also, like, I want you to understand that you are now the leaders. Like, I want you to understand that when they say it is your time, they're talking about you. They're not talking about me anymore. Like, my time came, and I did, like, my generation did what they can. And my generation will continue to do things, but my generation has pushed the envelope just a little bit so that your generation can now take the baton and really do something with it. I'm like, you have so much. Like, you have social media, you have so much in you, and so much potential, and so much power. And I need y'all to understand that, and I need you to use it. And I need you to go ahead and think about that, because if you want money, if you want opportunities, if you, I don't want you to look at things as just you. I want you to think about your little brothers, your little sisters, your cousins, if you ever have a daughter or a son. Like, what is the world that you want for them? What type of education do you want them to have? And strive for that. Don't strive for yourself, strive for them. Because when you strive for them, then you're striving for everybody. You're not just striving for yourself. Like, and that is what's needed. So, like, grab the baton and go and, like, mess things up. Like,
Mhm.
mess it up real, like, royally, because, like, we crawled so y'all could walk, and you're gonna walk so your kids can run. But we need to do the thing. We can't just wait for other people to do it. Like, we have to be the ones to do it. And it could be in a very small scale where you just help one person, but
Mhm.
helping that one person can mean helping a multitude of people, because you just changed that person's life.
I think it's true that especially the kids who are in high school right now, it's like, I mean, and I have been feeling this way since I was in high school, but just that, and I mean, I'm sure you've seen pictures of like Congress where everyone is just like old and white, and that they are gonna die soon. A lot of them are in their like 80s and 90s, and like slowly millennials and Gen Z are gonna be able to start getting in there and fucking shit up and tearing shit down if they wanted to. So I think that is exciting. I think that's Anyway, we gotta wrap things up, so let's go into the other room. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
This has been Time is Money. Beep boop ba doop ba doop beep boop ba da ba doop ba doop beep doop boop boop boop.